The Zoltori Empire stood as the most powerful force in the galaxy, a legend whispered in every corner of the universe. For centuries, they had conquered planet after planet, crushing any race that dared oppose them. Their military might was unmatched, their ships were larger than entire moons, and their weapons could wipe out whole cities with a single blast. The Zoltori were not just conquerors, they were gods in the eyes of those they ruled. Their empire stretched across countless star systems, each planet bending under their control, from icy worlds on the edge of the galaxy to thriving cities filled with exotic species. Nothing had ever come close to challenging their reign. The Zoltori people were not human. They were taller, their skin an unnerving shade of dark violet, their eyes glowing with an almost supernatural intensity. Their leader, Emperor Karath, was a being of immense power, a strategist so cunning that many thought he could predict the future. Under his rule, the Zoltori had become a symbol of invincibility. Their technology was centuries ahead of anything the galaxy had ever seen. Their warships could slip through the folds of space itself, appearing at a moment's notice and wiping out any resistance with ease. The Zoltori didn't just destroy their enemies, they humiliated them, breaking their spirit before taking their planet. For most, the idea of facing the Zoltori in battle was as terrifying as the idea of fighting an unstoppable storm. Resistance against them was a dream, a thought that never crossed the minds of lesser species. No one dared challenge them because, no matter how many forces they gathered, the Zoltori would crush them without hesitation. They didn't negotiate, they conquered. And anyone who dared to stand in their way would quickly learn the futility of their efforts. But there was one planet in the galaxy that had never been on the radar of the Zoltori. A small, insignificant blue planet known as Earth. To the Empire, Earth was a primitive world, home to nothing more than weak humans. They had never heard of a species so frail and unimportant. The humans had yet to discover space travel, and their strongest weapons barely scratched the surface of modern technology. For the Zoltori, the idea of a war with humans was laughable. To them, Earth was a mere dot on the map, an easy target for expansion. And yet, the humans had caught the attention of Emperor Karath. As the most powerful ruler in the universe, Karath's empire expanded relentlessly. One by one, he conquered entire star systems, absorbing countless civilizations into his grasp. The Zoltori fleet, an immense armada capable of traversing the void of space with incredible speed, had been preparing for its next mission, Earth. Karath ordered the fleet to proceed to Earth, confident that this new world would fall just like all the others. He knew that the Zoltori tactics were foolproof and that no resistance could withstand the might of his armies. The humans, as primitive as they were, stood no chance against his unbeatable fleet. As the Zoltori ships emerged from the darkness of space, their presence was felt even before they arrived in Earth's atmosphere. The sky above Earth began to darken as their colossal warships blocked out the sun, casting an ominous shadow over the planet. Karath watched with pride as his forces prepared to invade. They would land on Earth, and humanity would be forced to submit just like every other species that had crossed his path. The humans would not have the luxury of fighting back. They would be crushed beneath the Zoltori's boots, their cities reduced to rubble. But there was something the Zoltori did not expect. They underestimated the humans in a way they never had before. To them, the humans were no more than insects, unworthy of attention. They had never bothered to learn about Earth's history, its people, or its capacity for survival. The Zoltori believed that all intelligent species operated the same way, that they were all driven by the same basic instinct: survival, power, fear. But they didn't understand humanity. They had never faced a species that would not simply bow down when faced with destruction. The humans on Earth knew something was coming, even before the Zoltori ships appeared in the sky. They had monitored strange signals from space, had tracked the movements of alien ships. But they couldn't fathom the scale of the invasion that was about to take place. At first, many were terrified. News spread like wildfire, and panic set in. The world's leaders scrambled to prepare, but no one knew how to fight back against an enemy like this. They had never seen anything like the Zoltori before, and their technology was nothing compared to the alien invaders. Some countries tried to rally their armies, But deep down, everyone knew it was hopeless. Humanity was facing an enemy that was beyond their wildest nightmares. But there was one person who saw something others didn't, a chance, however slim, to turn the tide. Dr. Clara Johnson, a brilliant military strategist, had been following the movements of the Zoltori fleet. Unlike most of the world's leaders, she wasn't consumed by fear. She studied their tactics, their behaviors, their patterns. Clara knew that if humanity stood a chance, it would have to come from somewhere unexpected. It wouldn't be through brute force, as the Zoltori expected. It would be through something the Zoltori couldn't understand: the human mind. While the Zoltori saw only the power of their fleets and weapons, Clara understood that strategy was the true weapon. She believed that, although humanity might not have the military strength to defeat the Zoltori, they had something far more valuable: intelligence. And it was that intelligence, sharp and unpredictable, that could be their salvation. But this wasn't going to be a simple battle. Clara knew the only way to survive would be to play a mind game that the Zoltori would never see coming. She had one chance, and the fate of humanity rested in her hands. The stage was set, and the Zoltori Empire had no idea what was coming. They believed victory was guaranteed, but for the first time in their existence, they were about to learn that they had underestimated an opponent they could never have predicted. A human, armed with nothing but her wits and a strategy, was about to change the course of galactic history forever. As the Zoltori fleet loomed over Earth, an unshakable tension gripped the planet. For days, the sky had been darkened by the shadow of their colossal ships, and humans everywhere could feel the weight of the invasion. News reports flooded every screen, but no one had a clear answer. Governments scrambled to figure out how to defend themselves, but the people were terrified. They had never faced anything like this. The Zoltori didn't just want to conquer, they wanted to wipe out any resistance before it could even begin. It was clear to everyone that the Zoltori Empire believed victory was a foregone conclusion. The invaders were calculating and precise, their ships gliding effortlessly through space, arriving without warning. They didn't need to negotiate, they didn't need to ask. They simply took. But there was a single, quiet voice among the chaos that refused to accept the inevitable. Dr. Clara Johnson, a name that hadn't meant much to the world until now, had an idea. An idea so bold, so risky, that it could either save humanity or doom them entirely. Clara was a strategist, a mind trained to see patterns where others saw only chaos. And while the world trembled, Clara's mind was already working, looking for a way to fight back. In her office, high above the city, Clara paced back and forth, staring at the vast expanse of the alien fleet hovering just outside Earth's atmosphere. She wasn't afraid. She knew fear had no place in this moment. What she needed was a plan, a way to win. And then it hit her. The Zoltori believed they had nothing to fear from the humans. They had never bothered to study Earth's people, never taken the time to understand them. They saw humans as weak, insignificant, and incapable of challenging their might. But Clara knew something they didn't. Humans had something no other species had: ingenuity. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Clara would propose a contest, a game of strategy and intellect. A challenge the Zoltori couldn't resist. If they were truly as superior as they claimed, they would accept the challenge without hesitation. After all, they believed their empire was untouchable. Karath, the emperor of the Zoltori, was renowned for his tactical genius. He had led his empire to victory countless times, defeating enemies with ease. His pride was legendary, and Clara knew that this pride would be his greatest weakness. Without wasting any more time, Clara sent a communication to the Zoltori fleet. She had no idea how they would respond, but she knew this was the only shot humanity had. The message was brief. To the point: I challenge you, Emperor Karath, to a game of strategy. If you are truly the genius you claim to be, you will accept. If you win, Earth is yours. If you lose, you leave. The response came faster than Clara expected. Within hours, Karath's voice echoed through the communication channels, his tone dripping with condescension. You dare challenge me? He boomed, his deep, commanding voice vibrating through the speakers. You think you can outsmart the might of the Zoltori Empire? This will be your downfall. Clara's heart raced, but she kept her face calm. The challenge had been accepted. It was a risky move, one that could easily backfire, but it was also humanity's only hope. The game would begin. The Zoltori had no concept of the type of game Claire had in mind. To them, it was all about power, about dominating through force and fear. Clara, on the other hand, knew that this game would be different. It wouldn't be a battle fought with weapons or fleets. It would be a battle fought with the mind. Karath and his generals, with all their military might and technology, had no idea what they were walking into. ASA, the challenge was set in motion. Claire immediately began working on the rules. It would be a mind game, a series of moves that would test not just the intellect of the players, but their ability to predict, deceive, and manipulate. She knew that the Zoltori would play with the same arrogance that had always defined them, assuming that their military superiority would give them an edge. But that's where Claire's plan would strike. The humans, with their ability to think outside the box, would surprise them at every turn. They wouldn't play by the rules the Zoltori expected. The game was to be held in a virtual arena, a space created to simulate a series of tactical challenges. Both Clara and Karath would have to plan, anticipate, and outwit one another, using only their minds. No weapons, no armies, just the battle of ideas. As the day of the game approached, the world held its breath. Some had given up hope entirely, thinking the Zoltori's victory was inevitable. But Clara knew that hope wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed to show the world what humanity was capable of, to prove that their strength didn't lie in the size of their armies or the power of their weapons, but in their minds. The hour arrived, and the game began. It was unlike anything the Zoltori had ever seen. Clara's moves were precise, calculated, and unpredictable. She began by placing her pieces in positions that seemed weak, almost foolish, to the Zoltori generals. But what they didn't realize was that every piece was part of a greater plan, a plan that would slowly, steadily begin to unravel their overconfidence. The Zoltori generals laughed at first. They thought it was a joke, a game they would easily win. Korath himself scoffed at Clara's strategy, thinking he could simply steamroll her with his superior intellect. But with every move Claire made, something strange began to happen. The Zoltori started to hesitate. They weren't used to being outsmarted. They weren't used to being forced to think, to question their every decision. Claire wasn't just playing the game. She was manipulating their minds, making them second-guess themselves, making them question their superiority. With each passing move, the human strategist gained ground. And for the first time in the history of the Zoltori Empire, their confidence began to crack. Clara's game had just begun, and Karath, for all his arrogance, was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. The virtual arena appeared in front of both Clara and Karath, its vast, empty space designed to simulate an environment where both players could challenge each other's intellect. It was a neutral ground, free from any physical advantage or weaponry. There were no armies to command, no spaceships to maneuver, just two minds, locked in a battle of pure strategy. The moment the game began, the tension in the air thickened, palpable across the entire planet. For humanity, this was their last chance. For Karath and the Zoltori, it was a simple, arrogant test of their intellectual superiority. They were convinced that victory would be theirs in no time. After all, the Zoltori Empire had never known defeat. Clara stood in front of her monitor, calm yet focused. Her fingers hovered over the controls as she took her first move, placing her pieces carefully on the virtual board. Every choice she made was deliberate, a step toward the larger strategy that no one could see yet. On the other side, Karath stared down at his own virtual battlefield, his violet eyes narrowed in concentration. His pride was his greatest strength and his biggest weakness. He had always relied on his intellect to lead his empire to victory, and he was confident that this human challenge would be no different. He believed that no being, no matter how clever, could outthink him. He had already mentally calculated how the game would unfold, certain that the humans would collapse under the weight of his brilliance. But Clara's first move was like nothing he had ever seen. She didn't start with an aggressive play, as he had expected. Instead, Clara made what seemed like a simple, almost passive move. She placed a pawn in a corner of the board, seemingly out of harm's way. Karath smirked, thinking this was the moment he'd been waiting for. He had been trained to spot weaknesses, and this move appeared to be a glaring one. He quickly countered by positioning his own pieces for an offensive, anticipating a swift victory. He wasn't worried. After all, who could possibly predict his moves? He was a master strategist. But Clara wasn't playing for the immediate advantage. She was playing the long game. With each new move, she slowly but steadily set her pieces in place, testing Karath's perception, pushing him to make decisions based on his assumptions. She knew his arrogance would be his downfall, and she was patient enough to wait for him to reveal his own weaknesses. As Karath's virtual army advanced, Clara's smile barely flickered. She was unshaken, calm as ever. She'd already anticipated his next few moves, and she was ready to spring her trap. Karath, however, didn't notice the subtle shift in the game. He pressed forward with increasing confidence, unaware that Clara's seemingly simple moves were slowly leading him into a mental labyrinth of his own making. The Zaltori were masters of combat, and Karath was a genius in warfare, but this wasn't a battle of ships or soldiers. This was a battle of minds, and in that realm, humans had a distinct advantage. Where the Zaltori relied on their superior technology and overwhelming power, humans had the ability to think unpredictably, to adapt in ways that their enemies could never foresee. Clara knew that in this game, it was not about outsmarting Karath in the traditional sense, it was about making him doubt himself. As the game progressed, Clara's calmness began to unsettle Karath. His generals watched him closely, their faces stern, trying to gauge his reactions. They were used to Karath's decisiveness, his natural confidence in any situation. But now, as they observed him studying the board, they saw cracks in his composure. Karath was beginning to question the moves he had made. He would glance at Clara's pieces, seemingly innocent at first, but now starting to line up in patterns he couldn't predict. What was she doing? What was her strategy? Clara wasn't just playing the game, she was playing with Karath's mind. Karath's eyes narrowed as he tried to make sense of her next move. It was an unexpected combination of pieces, unlike anything he would have done himself. For a moment, his confidence wavered, but he quickly recovered. This was only a small setback, he thought. The game was still in his control. Or so he believed. But Claire had already anticipated his next decision. With a single move, she broke his chain of thought. Her piece, which had seemed unimportant earlier, suddenly moved with a swift grace, shifting the entire balance of the board. Karath's pride faltered. His eyes widened. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't the way the game was supposed to go. For the first time in his life, Emperor Karath felt something he had never experienced before: uncertainty. The brilliance he had relied on for so long now felt inadequate. His once impenetrable confidence began to crack as Clara's strategic play dug deeper into his mind, making him question everything he had assumed about the game. With each move, Clara's presence became more intimidating. She wasn't just a human strategist, she was a force of nature, a player of the highest caliber. Karath tried to shake off the feeling. He needed to regain control. The Zaltori Empire had never known defeat, and he would not let it happen now. But as he reached for his next move, a voice in the back of his mind told him that he was losing. Not just the game, but something far more dangerous. His pride was at risk, and he couldn't bear the thought of it. Meanwhile, on Earth, the people were watching, their eyes glued to every screen. Claire had become a symbol of hope for all of humanity. They could only watch in silence, their breaths held, waiting to see if their minds could truly outwit the might of the Zaltori. For every move Clara made, for every challenge she threw Karath's way, a wave of excitement and nervous energy rippled through the world. It wasn't just a game anymore, it was a test of humanity's will. Karath's next move was hasty, perhaps more emotional than logical. Clara saw the opening. She didn't hesitate. With a calculated precision, she made her counterattack. She was not only winning the game, she was making Karath doubt the very foundation of his empire. He had been so sure of his superiority, so convinced of his place at the top of the universe. But in the game of minds, Claire had outsmarted him. Slowly, steadily, she was taking the upper hand. And as Karath sat there, his hand hovering over the board, Clara couldn't help but smile. The game had only just begun, but already, the most powerful empire in the galaxy was beginning to realize that the human mind was not something to be underestimated. The tension in the virtual arena reached its peak as Clara and Karath continued their game. What had started as a simple challenge had transformed into a battle of wits, one that would determine not just the fate of Earth, but the future of the entire Zoltori Empire. Karath's once unshakable confidence was starting to crumble, and it wasn't just his pride at stake now. With every move Clara made, he felt himself losing grip on something far more important, the perception of his empire's invincibility. The Zoltori had never been tested like this before, and the more he tried to fight back, the more it seemed that Clara was one step ahead. Karath stared at the board, his mind racing. He could feel the eyes of his generals on him, their silence deafening as they watched their emperor falter. His fingers trembled slightly, and for the first time in his life, Karath realized that he was in danger. Not just of losing the game, but of losing control. The pride that had fueled his rise now seemed like a weakness, a blinding force that kept him from seeing the truth. He had underestimated the human strategist. He had underestimated Clara Johnson. Meanwhile, Clara sat back in her chair, her focus unwavering. Her every move had been carefully planned, not just to win, but to manipulate Karath's mind. She knew he was growing desperate, she could feel it in the subtle shift of his movements. She had pushed him into a corner, and now he was reacting out of instinct rather than strategy. His confidence had been replaced by hesitation, and Clara was ready to strike. She had anticipated this moment for days, preparing for the exact moment when Karath's arrogance would turn against him. The game, once an intellectual challenge, had become a psychological battle. Clara was no longer just playing a game of strategy, she was playing with Karath's mind. Every move she made, no matter how small, had been designed to plant seeds of doubt. She could see it now, reflected in his hesitant gaze. Karath wasn't thinking clearly anymore. The great emperor of the Zoltori Empire was no longer sure of himself. He was no longer sure of anything. Karath's hand hovered over the board as he considered his next move. The pieces in front of him seemed to blur together, each one more confusing than the last. His mind was no longer the sharp weapon it had once been. Clara had turned his confidence into his downfall, and now he had to decide whether he would admit defeat or fight back in a way that he had never done before. But there was no easy way out. Every path seemed to lead to failure. The silence in the room was deafening. Clara had made her move, and now it was Karath's turn to act. His generals watched him carefully, exchanging glances. They knew that something was wrong. They could feel the shift in the air. The great emperor, once a symbol of invincibility, was beginning to show cracks. Karath had always been a master of strategy, and yet this simple human had brought him to the brink of collapse. Karath finally slammed his fist down on the table, a rare outburst of anger. "This cannot be," he roared, his voice echoing in the chamber. His generals flinched, but no one dared to speak. The emperor's fury was legendary, but even his rage couldn't help him now. He was trapped in a mental labyrinth of his own making, and Clara had guided him into it, step by step. Clara's lips curled into a faint smile. She had anticipated his outburst. Karath's anger was a mask, a last-ditch effort to regain control. But Clara saw through it. She knew that his mind was already unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Every move he made now seemed forced, a reaction rather than a carefully calculated decision. It was clear that Karath was no longer thinking like the strategic genius he had once been. He was panicking. And that, Clara knew, was her victory. The turning point had arrived. Karath had made his first mistake in the game, not a strategic error, but a mental one. He had lost his cool, and once that happened, the game was no longer about the pieces on the board. It was about control, and Clara had taken it from him. She had made him doubt himself. She had made him doubt everything. Karath's hand shook as he reached for a piece, but Clara was ready. With a move so simple, so devastating, she ended the game. It was a move that seemed almost too obvious, too easy, but that's exactly what made it so powerful. Karath stared at the board, his eyes wide in disbelief. It was over. The great Zaltori Emperor had been outsmarted by a human. His empire, built on the belief in their unmatched superiority, was now facing an unexpected defeat. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The virtual arena, once filled with the sounds of calculated moves and confident commands, was now still. Clara leaned back in her chair, breathing in the quiet victory. She had done it. Against all odds, she had defeated the might of the Zaltori Empire with nothing more than her mind. The humans had won. Karath's generals stared at the screen in disbelief. They had seen their emperor's defeat, and now they had to face the reality of it. For centuries, the Zaltori had crushed every enemy that dared to challenge them. But now, they were the ones who had been defeated. The turning point had come, and there was no going back. Clara's brilliant strategy had shattered their pride, and they would have to learn to live with the consequences. As the game ended, the humans who had been watching from Earth erupted into cheers. They had witnessed something no one thought possible. The human mind, with its creativity, unpredictability, and ingenuity, had triumphed over the most powerful empire in the galaxy. But Clara knew this victory was only the beginning. There was still a war to fight, and the Zaltori would not give up easily. Yet, the first victory had been claimed, and it was a victory that would go down in history. The tide had turned. The virtual arena flickered and then disappeared, replaced by a stark, silent void. For the first time in his life, Karath felt truly alone. The echoes of his empire's might, once so loud and commanding, were now silent. Clara's final move had shattered more than just the pieces on the board. It had torn apart the very foundation of the Zaltori Empire. The realization hit him like a crashing wave. His empire, built on centuries of power and pride, was now on the edge of collapse. He had lost not just the game, but everything he had believed in. Karath remained seated in the darkened war room, staring at the empty space in front of him. His generals, once eager to see their emperor triumph, now watched in silence, their faces ashen. The great Zaltori Empire, the force that had crushed countless civilizations, had been defeated by a single human mind. It was incomprehensible. The realization of what had just happened settled like a cold weight in his chest. The very thing he had thought was his greatest strength, the ability to command and control, had been exploited, turned against him in the most unexpected way. "What do we do now?" one of his generals asked quietly, breaking the silence that had enveloped them. His voice trembled, uncertainty creeping in as it dawned on him that everything had changed. Karath, still in shock, didn't respond. His mind raced, but there were no answers, no plans. The game had been more than just a game. Clara had forced him to confront something he had never considered, the possibility that the Zaltori Empire could be overthrown, not by brute force or military strength, but by intelligence. Human intelligence. He had thought they were no match for his brilliance, but in a moment of clarity, he realized he had miscalculated. He had allowed himself to be outwitted. The realization spread through the ranks. The room began to feel like a prison. The weight of defeat pressed heavily on Karath. His generals shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, trying to gauge if anyone else had an answer, if anyone knew what to do next. But there was no escape from the truth. The Zaltori had lost, and there was no coming back from it. On Earth, the celebration was immediate. People screamed with joy, cheered, and hugged each other. A victory that had once seemed impossible had been won. Claire's name spread like wildfire across every screen, every news broadcast. She had defeated the Zaltori, the most powerful empire in the galaxy, using nothing but her mind. To humanity, she had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the mightiest can fall when faced with the unpredictability and creativity of the human mind. But Clara herself remained calm, her focus unwavering. She knew this victory was just the first step. The Zaltori would not give up without a fight. They were an empire of warriors, and Karath was not one to accept defeat easily. As words spread across the Zaltori Empire, shockwaves of panic rippled through every command center. Karath's defeat wasn't just a loss in a game, it was a blow to the Empire's very core. 1,000 years of dominance couldn't withstand the humiliation that came with losing to a human. But the true depth of the collapse wasn't just in Karath's personal failure, It was in the realization that the Zoltori had never truly understood their enemy. They had relied on their military power, on their invincibility, and they had ignored the one thing that had always made humanity dangerous: their ability to think differently. Korath finally stood up, his body stiff, his mind a whirl of confusion and anger. He knew he had to act quickly. The Zoltori Empire could not afford to fall into chaos. If news of his defeat reached the entire galaxy, the Empire would crumble from within. Rebellion was inevitable, and once that happened, there would be no turning back. But even as he thought about the steps he needed to take to regain control, one truth remained: he had lost. The Empire was no longer the unstoppable force it once was. "You are not the leader you once were," a voice echoed behind him. Korath turned sharply, surprised to hear the words spoken aloud. It was one of his most trusted advisors, someone he had fought beside for centuries. The advisor's gaze was unwavering, and there was no trace of respect in his eyes. "You've made a grave mistake, Korath. The Empire cannot follow a leader who has been so thoroughly defeated." The words stung, but Korath knew they were true. He was broken. The Empire he had once led with iron will was now slipping through his fingers, and there was no way to hold it together. The fall of the Empire had begun, and it was not going to be stopped by a single, desperate act of will. The advisor's words echoed in Korath's mind as he turned away, stepping out into the hall. It felt as though the very walls were closing in on him. His generals, his soldiers, all watched him with growing uncertainty. His reputation was in tatters. His authority was shattered. The empire he had worked so hard to build was now crumbling beneath him. And it wasn't just the Zoltori Empire that was shaking. Throughout the galaxy, news of their defeat spread like wildfire. Planets that had long been oppressed by the Zoltori began to rise up, inspired by humanity's unexpected victory. The Zoltori had been beaten by a human. The unbeatable empire had been defeated not by strength or war, but by the very thing they had never taken seriously: the human mind. Korath stood alone in the silence of his war room, the weight of the empire's fall pressing down on him. He had lost. And in that loss, he had made the greatest mistake of his life. He had underestimated humanity. The empire that had once ruled the galaxy was now a shadow of its former self, and there was no telling how far the ripple effects of Clara's victory would spread. For Korath, there was no redemption. The empire was no longer his to command. It had been brought down by the most unexpected force: human ingenuity. And as the empire crumbled, the galaxy began to change.